Well, good afternoon, everybody from Paris, and welcome to the Energy Technology Perspectives 2017 webinar. My name is Elina Levin, and I'm the project manager of the Energy Technology Perspectives 2017 project, and I'm moderating today's presentations. As an introduction, I would like to say a couple of words about the ETP project and also how we'll proceed in this webinar. As many of you know, the Energy Technology Perspectives series is the IEA's comprehensive publication focusing on energy technologies and policies that contribute to the energy sector decarbonization while enabling energy security and economic development. Since 2006, the IEA has been providing strategic guidance on energy technology and related policy through this publication, keeping stakeholders informed about technological trends, advances, and opportunities. This year, the ETP 2017 presents various energy sector development paths to 2016. Each scenario has different implications for technology deployment and energy policies, as well as the resulting transformations of the energy sector. For the first time, ETP 2017 shows how the energy sector could become carbon neutral by 2060, if known technology innovations were pushed to the limit. The ETP publication includes two general chapters, the global outlook and tracking clean energy progress. It has 4 sector-specific chapters, analyzing how various energy sectors such as electricity, industry, transport, and buildings contribute to the ambitious clean energy transformation, and 2 cross-sectoral chapters featuring carbon capture and storage and bioenergy. The ETP publication this year is being presented in 2 webinars. This is the second webinar, and today we will focus on presenting transformations in the building sector, transport sector, the role of bioenergy in low-carbon scenarios, as well as our views on the critical role that system integration can play in energy sector decarbonization. The first webinar took place on June 29th, and you can find the recording of that webinar and the slide deck on the IEA webpage. All materials from today's webinar, as well as the recording and PowerPoint presentations, will also be posted on our webpage. Today we have 6 presentations. Each will take about 15 minutes, and at the end of the webinar there will be time for questions. You can send your questions at any time during the webinar. Before we start, we would like to express our gratitude to around 200 contributors and reviewers. The report benefited from data, expertise, valuable feedback provided by many colleagues inside and outside of the IEA. I would like to mention my predecessor, Daniele Paponi, who managed the ETP project, or 2017 project, in its earlier phase. We would also like to acknowledge the leadership of the IEA Executive Director, Fatih Birol, the Director of Sustainability, Technology and Outlooks, Kamo de Nasser, and the Head of the Energy Technology and Policy Division, Jean-François Gagny. In addition, ETP draws on unique IEA Energy Technology Network. Many experts from various IEA technology collaboration programs provided data and suggestions. And now we move to the presentations of this webinar. Unfortunately, Jean-François Gagny had technical problems joining the webinar, so I'll ask Samantha, my colleague, to present the setting presentation and as well the global outlook presentation that will follow. And I would also like to acknowledge Eric Manasset, who was another author of the global outlook chapter of the ETP 2017. Samantha, please, you have the floor.
Thank you, Elena, and good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to start today by providing a bit of some background on the global energy sector today, and some key points of orientation. There's no question that global energy markets are changing rapidly, particularly when seen in a historical context. We saw in 2016 that renewables supplied half of global electricity demand growth, and the increase in nuclear capacity reached its highest level since 1993. And this was on the back of some new generation coming online in China particularly. We've seen improvements in global energy intensity of around 2.1%. We also saw a record year in electric vehicle sales, which were up 40%, around 760,000 units last year. Of course, the energy sector remains key to sustainable economic growth. We still have 1.2 billion people who lack access to electricity, and 2.7 billion people who lack access to clean cooking fuels. The energy sector is the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions today and the largest source of air pollution, which is linked to 6.5 million premature deaths per year. Now, these concerns are increasingly driving policy and investment decisions. There is also no single story about the future of the global energy sector, with key differences amongst regions and with technology deployment. The energy landscape has been shifting. The first decade of the century saw an amazing increase in energy demand. That was primarily fueled by coal, almost 50% growth. However, since 2010, energy demand increased much more slowly, less than a third of the growth, which was around 900 million tonnes of oil equivalent. And this was met almost equally by oil, gas and renewables at close to a third each, with a slight role for coal at 10%. The global energy intensity of GDP declined by 12% between 2010 and 2016, or expressed differently, that's that 2.1% improvement that we've seen each year. Energy sector CO2 emissions have also been stable since 2014, and this is notwithstanding continued global economic growth. In 2016, CO2 emissions declined, primarily driven by developments in the US and China. In the US, we saw a decline of around 3% in CO2 emissions, largely as a result of a shift to unconventional gas and a declining in use of coal, as well as increased penetration of renewables. In China, emissions fell by around 1% as coal demand declined, even though the economy expanded by 6.7%. There are several reasons for this trend, included the increased share of renewables, nuclear and natural gas in the power sector, but also a switch from coal to gas in the industrial and building sector, and that was in large part driven by air pollution concerns. It's too soon to say if emissions have peaked, but this decoupling of economic growth and emissions would need to be accelerated if climate targets are to be achieved. Now, as Alina mentioned, in our Energy Technology Perspectives publication this year, we have mapped 3 very different scenarios for the energy sector. The first of those is the Reference Technology Scenario, or RTS, and this represents, this scenario takes into account current and announced policy measures, including those contained in nationally determined contributions that were pledged in the lead up to the Paris climate negotiations. The scenario is not consistent with achieving global climate ambitions. It would see an average temperature increase of around 2.7 degrees by 2100. And while it's not necessarily meeting climate targets, it does represent a significant improvement on a business as usual trajectory if there had been no meaningful climate abatement or emissions abatement policies. The second scenario we model is the 2-degree scenario. As the name would suggest, it looks at the efforts required to move from the current pathway, or the RTS, to limiting future temperatures to 2 degrees. The overall task in terms of achieving a 2-degree scenario is an emissions abatement of around 760 gigatons of carbon dioxide. So there's a significant gap here between the RTS and the 2DS, and it requires a mix of technologies to achieve these emissions reductions. Now you can see here that energy efficiency and renewables take a lead at 40% and 35% respectively. Fuel switching also plays a role in nuclear at 5 and 6%, and carbon capture and storage technologies account for around 14% of those cumulative emissions reductions needed, and that's across both industry and power applications. Now, for the first time this year, the Energy Technology Perspectives also considered how far technologies that are currently available or that are in the innovation pipeline could take us beyond this already ambitious 2-degree pathway. The B2DS, or the beyond 2 degree scenario, sees energy sector emissions reach net zero by 2060, with global average temperature increases of around 1.75 degrees by 2100. So this falls roughly within the midpoint of the range of ambitions that were expressed in the Paris Agreement. The relative contribution of technologies changes in this very aggressive scenario. Efficiency continues to do much of the heavy lifting at 34%, but there is a stronger role for CCS at 32%. This is due to the role of CCS in achieving deep emissions reductions across the industry sector and also in supporting negative emissions through its combination with bioenergy. The B2DS is technically feasible, but in practice it would represent a formidable challenge that would rely on a fundamental and immediate shift in the level of global action. Today's level of development is far from that needed for a 2 degree scenario, and even worse for the B2DS. Some technologies have almost not progressed in the last few years, and in our Tracking Clean Energy Progress report, we've assessed 4 key technologies as being not on track. That includes carbon capture and storage, which would require around a 10-fold increase to be on track for a 2 degree target by 2025. More efficient coal-fired power generation is also not on track. Around a third of all new capacity additions in 2016 were subcritical, and under our scenario, our 2 degree scenario, we would need to see around a 3% decrease in emissions from the coal fleet every year for that sector to be on track. Technologies that have shown improvement but require further acceleration and further investment include nuclear, transport, fuel economy of light-duty vehicles, energy-intensive industrial processes, and lighting, appliance and building equipment. And we assess that 3 groups of technologies are on track for a 2 degree target by 2025. That includes solar PV and onshore wind, which we've seen very impressive cost reductions in those technologies on the back of strong policy support. Energy storage and batteries particularly have seen significant improvement and deployment, and electric vehicles, as I spoke of earlier, we've had a record year in 2016 for electric vehicles. A rapid ramp up in the deployment of low carbon power technologies is required in the 2DS and the B2DS. And this, for most technologies, would be well beyond historical deployment rates. This will require coordinated and timely efforts across various sectors in the electricity system, from manufacturers to producers, transmission and distribution system operators and regulators, as well as electricity consumers. Beside the technical challenge, mobilising the capital required will be a further effort to be tackled. The B2DS requires in the power sector cumulative investments of $61 trillion. Now this is 60% more than in the reference technology scenario. And the additional costs of the B2DS relative to the RTS increased by around 30% compared to the additional costs needed for the 2DS, which highlights the step change and additional challenges in the power sector of moving from the already ambitious 2DS to B2DS pathways. Now, some technologies would require very, very significant ramp up from historical levels, particularly in that 2030 to 2060 period, and that includes solar PV and CCS. So significant effort and attention needed on those technologies to achieve a B2DS pathway. In the industrial sector, industrial materials such as steel, cement and chemicals remain critical for economic and social development. The production of a number of major materials continues to expand in all of the scenarios, but in the B2DS would require these materials to be produced and used in the most efficient way possible to minimise their impact on energy demand and the carbon footprint. So several key strategies enable energy and CO2 emissions reductions in the industry sector, includes materials efficiency, energy efficiency, best available technology deployment, fuel and feedstock switching, and innovative processes, including carbon capture and storage. In the period to 2030, energy and materials efficiency play the most important role, while technologies such as CCS enable the deep emissions reductions needed post-2030. And in particular, in industry, early action is important to avoid the lock-in of emissions and emissions-intensive equipment and avoid the need for additional investment and more drastic action over the long term. CCS technologies play a very significant role in the 2DS pathway, with its use almost equally split between industrial uses and power. This requires a very significant scale-up from today. Today we have around 17 large-scale projects operating, including 2 applied to coal-fired power generation. And these projects are capable of capturing around 30 million tonnes of CO2 per year. But in the 2DS and the B2DS scenario, you can see that a very significant scale-up is required. By 2060 in the 2DS, we would have 6.4 gigatons of CO2 being captured from power and industrial processes within that time frame. In the B2DS, this is increased to 11.2 gigatons. China and the US lead the way in terms of CCS deployment in the period to 2030, accounting for around half of all global deployment and more than 1/3 of the deployment after 2030. So this is a global challenge in terms of deploying CCS and scaling up to this level. Technology innovation and clean energy research, development and demonstration spending will be important to underpin any low emissions pathway. However, despite this clear need for innovation, investment in clean energy R&D has virtually stalled at around $26 billion annually, and most of this comes from governments and state-owned enterprises. To try to put this in context, the top 3 IT companies spend considerably more on their RD&D than the global clean energy sector, and those companies are Amazon, Google and Intel. However, there are opportunities to boost this spending now. The Mission Innovation Initiative that was announced in conjunction at the Paris climate negotiations saw 23 governments pledge to double their clean energy R&D spending, and this could represent another $31 billion in investment by 2021. So this is an important initiative not only to provide that additional investment into clean energy spending, but also in terms of promoting greater collaboration on some of these key technologies that we discussed in the Energy Technology Perspectives report. So in conclusion, early signs do point to changes in the energy sector, but progress is too slow. We need to adopt an integrated systems approach, considering all technology options in order to accelerate progress. Achieving carbon neutrality by 2060 would require unprecedented technology policies and investment, and that role for technology innovation remains critical. It requires policy support across all stages of the technology cycle, including collaborative approaches. So with that, I will now move to the global outlook part of the presentation. So in the Global Outlook chapter, we aim, as the name suggests, to provide an overview of some of the key themes and trends across the various sectors that are discussed in the ETP publication, so across buildings, transport, power, etc. I'm only going to provide a very brief overview of the chapter, but some takeaways really that I would like to highlight are that, of course, despite the significant shifts that we've seen in the global landscape, the current efforts that we're seeing fall well short of achieving long-term goals, that we need to be investing across a portfolio of clean energy technologies. And as I was just saying, technology innovation remains key across all our scenarios. So we model technologies that are currently commercially available or at a stage where they could become commercially available within the scenario period. However, that continued technology innovation is critical to reduce costs, to improve technology performance, and to pull through more nascent technologies. So we would emphasise that as a priority moving forward. And as I said, rapid and aggressive deployment of this portfolio of clean energy technologies could deliver a carbon neutral energy system by 2060, but this really would be a formidable challenge that requires a fundamental and immediate shift in the level of action that we're currently seeing. So to put the challenge in context, moving from that reference technology scenario to the 2DS would require emissions reductions around 760 gigatons of CO2, as I mentioned earlier. So that's around 22 years worth of current annual emissions from the energy sector. For the B2DS, the carbon budget is reduced by around 2/3 and a much faster trajectory to net zero is required. Now, the shift to a 2DS would require a significant change in the global primary energy mix. Fossil fuels today provide around 81% of the mix, but this would fall to around 35% in 2060 in the 2DS, and that represents an absolute decline of around 50% from today's level. And coal use experiences the largest decline, falling by 72% in absolute terms. The growth in primary energy demand would also need to be limited in the 2DS. In the RTS, it increases by almost 50% over the scenario period, but in the 2DS, this is restricted to around 17%, including due to rapid and aggressive implementation of energy efficiency measures. The transformation of the energy system at this scale required in the 2DS requires efforts across all supply and demand sectors. The rapid decarbonisation of the power sector is a key strategy for achieving the 2DS. You can see here that renewable technologies, CCS and nuclear deliver significant emissions reductions to support this decarbonisation. In the end-use sectors, energy efficiency and electrification are key strategies in order to achieve the 2DS. In terms of electrification, the share of electricity in the final energy demand of these key end-use sectors doubles in the 2DS, from around 18% today to 35% in 2060. So this means that the power sector has the dual challenge of absorbing this increase in electricity demand while also rapidly decarbonising. Early action on energy efficiency is critically important, not only to alleviate some of the pressure on the power sector, but to reduce emissions from direct reliance on fossil fuels in these sectors. We saw earlier that energy efficiency provides 40% of the cumulative emissions reductions needed in the 2DS, and it's particularly important in the building sector, where emissions need to be reduced by around 85% relative to the RTS. And we'll have a deep dive on the building sector later in the webinar. In terms of understanding the challenge of shifting beyond the 2DS, it's useful to look at the remaining emissions from the 2DS. You can see in this chart that the power sector, which is in purple, is virtually decarbonised by 2060 in the 2DS, and industry and transport become the largest sources of emissions. In the B2DS, we see a much faster decarbonisation of the power sector and deeper reductions in industry and transport. Now, CCS plays an important role in industry, which is part of the reason why we see the relative contribution of CCS increasing so markedly between the 2DS and the B2DS. And CCS is also important in supporting negative emissions. So in our model, this is achieved through bioenergy and CCS, and around 4 gigatons of negative emissions are needed in 2060 to offset the remaining emissions in industry and transport. These are emissions that are either too complex or cost prohibitive to be directly abated, notwithstanding the very aggressive measures that are employed in the B2DS in those sectors. Looking at the transformation of the power sector in the B2DS, we can see how challenging and ambitious this pathway would be. So the power sector would need to be decarbonised by 2050, and that's around a decade earlier than in the 2DS, and become a source of negative emissions thereafter. Unabated coal-fired power generation is phased out by 2040, and all coal and gas-fired generation is from plants equipped with CCS by 2050. Renewables account for around 80% of the generation in this scenario. So we'll hear more about the role of sustainable biomass later in the webinar, but it's useful at the outset to recognise the important role it plays both across sectors but also in all scenarios. Even in the RTS, the use of biomass or sustainable biomass doubles based on supportive policies. In the 2DS and the B2DS, we have recognised that there will be limitations on the availability of sustainable biomass, and so we've constrained its availability to around 145 exajoules in both scenarios. However, how this bioenergy is used between the 2DS and the more ambitious B2DS shifts, and most notably, a greater proportion of bioenergy with CCS, particularly in fuel transformation and the power sector, is needed. Now, this provides those negative emissions that are used to counterbalance the remaining emissions in industry and transport. And the first large-scale bioenergy with CCS project has actually commenced operation in the US in April this year, which has CCS applied to a bioethanol production facility. But as I showed earlier, we would need to see a significant scale up in terms of this technology with only around 17 CCS projects operating totally in total today. So there's obviously a very significant gap between where we're currently tracking and a 2DS pathway. And this obviously increases with ambitions for well below 2 degrees. So we need a significantly strengthened and accelerated policy framework, irrespective of which particular target we're aiming for. So specific policy actions are discussed in our sector chapters in the ETP. However, we identify 3 overarching priorities for consideration of policymakers. Now, that includes that greater support for technology innovation, including at all stages of the technology cycle, both in terms of supporting technology improvement for more mature technologies and cost reductions, but also innovation to help deliver new breakthroughs or game changers for the energy transition, which is quite feasible within this scenario period, but would require an increase in research and development funding. Better alignment of long-term climate ambitions and near-term policy actions could also support more efficient investment decisions and a smoother transition. The investments that are made in the period to 2030 will have a major impact on what can come next. And it's important that we develop the technologies and the institutions that are needed to support deep emissions reductions over the longer term. Now, CCS is one example of this, where we need the investment in particularly storage exploration and appraisal, and that needs to occur now to support the widespread deployment of CCS technologies in the future. And finally, improved integration of policy measures and planning across the entire energy system will be needed, including to account for the growing electrification of energy sectors and to support optimal use of limited resources such as bioenergy. Now, with that, I will hand over to my colleague. Yeah, I'll hand back to Alina. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Samantha. And thank you to everybody who is already sending their questions on this first presentation, but we'll get back to all the questions at the end of the webinar. And now we have a deeper dive into the demand side sectors, and we will start with the building sector. We have 2 analysts, John Dulac and Thibaut Aderger, who were the authors of the building sector chapter and will present their analysis today. Thibaut will start the presentation and then we'll hand over to John. So Thibaut, please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Alina. Historically, the IEA explored technology opportunities and policy strategies for the transition to sustainable buildings. For the ETP 2017 publication, the buildings team has examined how to accelerate this transition. So let me first set the scene and present the Global Building Status Report, looking in particular at the energy policy coverage, energy codes coverage, and the energy demand drivers. So the first thing to know is that buildings are not on track to meet climate ambitions, and especially the 2DS targets. So they are even less on track to meet the B2DS pathway. Especially, building envelopes have made very little progress, and we have seen some positive developments on lighting, appliances, and equipment, but we need to scale up the energy efficiency uptake in these demand sectors to meet the 2DS pathway. And the result is that we haven't seen yet the decoupling between the floor area growth and the intensity reduction. The intensity reduction, the purple dots, are far lower than floor area growth. So it means that energy demand increased globally. And this is even more true in non-OECD countries. So global building energy intensity per square meter should improve from 1.5% per year historically to nearly 3% per year. So it must double. Because floor area is driving energy demand growth, it is strategically important to look at where floor area is going to rise to set priorities. China and India will add 90 billion square meters by 2060. That's 40% of today's global floor area. And half of the floor area additions will be completed before 2035. Taking 2035 as a milestone after which half of floor area additions will be completed is pretty much true everywhere in the world. So it is urgent to set mandatory building codes for the whole building sector as soon as possible, because by 2035 we would have already missed half of the energy efficiency opportunities if the energy codes are not implemented and enforced. Why is it so urgent? Well, in India, Southeast Asia, North America, and even Latin America, nearly 50 billion square meters will be added by 2025, whereas there is no mandatory energy codes for the whole sector in place or enforced in these regions. 50 billion square meters, that's almost the floor area currently of North America, Japan, and Korea combined. So that's enormous. These regions have to turn blue on this map to avoid the locking of energy-intensive buildings. This was for the envelope part. Now let's look at the projections of final energy demand. In the RTS, we see that the building sector is globally increasing. Electrification is globally increasing because it's a way to drive energy efficiency and phase out gradually fossil fuels. Now, if we move to the 2DS, we see that the blue share is still large, but that energy efficiency uptake is much larger because it alleviates the constraints on the power sector, as Samantha said, and it enables it to decarbonize faster. Now, if you want to meet the B2DS trajectory, we would have to phase out completely fossil fuels and push renewables to a more larger extent. Going from the RTS to the B2DS would say with the equivalent of twice the global energy production in 2014. So buildings could really play a critical role in meeting climate mitigation ambitions. Now, how do we do that? We have first to implement stringent energy codes for new constructions and renovation. New constructions first for the areas where floor area is expected to rise, such as China, India, and Southeast Asia, as mentioned earlier. Near zero energy buildings are the key to meet these goals, and we expect to add 90 billion square meters of near zero energy buildings by 2060 in the 2DS or in the B2DS. But because building lifetimes are very long, there is a very low turnover, especially in OECD economies. So we also have to focus on retrofitting existing buildings. And that's 165 billion square meters that are expected to be retrofitted in OECD economies, mostly, but also in non-OECD economies, to make the average global envelope performance increase by 50% before 2060. We have to do this very soon, as fast as possible, because a small delay in achieving building envelope objectives could result in adding a considerable amount of energy demand. Just a 10-year delay, and assuming that we would catch up later in building envelope performance codes and standards, would result in added 30 exajoules of heating and cooling demand on top of the existing demand. The annual contribution might not be huge, but on the building's lifetime, it makes up 3 additional years of final consumption, especially in countries with rising floor area, rising cooling growth, and high heating demand. This was for the envelope part. Now I will leave the floor to John for the equipment part.
Thank you, Thibault. So, as Thibault mentioned, we see a critical window of opportunity for deploying envelope measures, which constitute a significant portion of the energy and emission savings potential we see for the building sector. At the same time, we haven't seen, as Thibault mentioned earlier, the type of progress that we would like to see for equipment in buildings, including heating and cooling equipment, as well as appliances and lighting. While we have seen some progress in recent years for technologies such as LED lighting, for the most part, these high-performance, energy-efficient, and low-carbon technologies still do not constitute the bulk of market demand today, and we do not see them reaching potential in a reference technology scenario between now and 2060. In a below 2-degree scenario, we would need to rapidly increase the uptake of these technologies, particularly as it relates to reducing energy demand, and especially electricity demand, with respect to upstream targets for decarbonization of the energy sector. And what you're seeing here on the far right, essentially, is a shift, as Thibault mentioned, away from fossil fuel technologies, even those that are more efficient, like condensing gas boilers, for example, to high-performance technologies like heat pumping technologies, solar thermal for hot water demand, especially in regions with rapidly growing growth in Southeast Asia and eventually in Africa, as well as a primary shift from fossil fuels in existing buildings, especially in OECD countries, where there's a large demand for gas in buildings today, off of those fossil fuel technologies, either to more efficient technologies like heat pumps or to integrated technologies like clean district energy systems, where in fact these technological shifts would perhaps make the most sense for existing buildings that already have in place a distributional system for hot water demand and heating. If we were to pursue these, what we see from the scenario results looking at the below 2DS to 2050 and 2060 is that we in fact could reduce historical trends over 40 years of statistical collection of data of building energy consumption in both IEA and non-IEA member countries, where historically we have not been able to decouple, as Thibault mentioned, growth in the building sector with respect to energy efficiency deployment. What you're seeing here on the left is the decomposition of the building sector with respect to changes in population growth, floor area activity, GDP, and other commercial activity, with respect to what you're seeing on the left as deployment of energy efficiency technologies. In a below 2-degree scenario, in fact, we think it's possible through aggressive deployment of high-performance technologies to reverse these trends and, in fact, reduce the net demand of building sector energy demand with respect to overall energy sector decarbonization strategies. Whereas Thibault mentioned this has a particular effect on upstream electricity generation, where the building sector today already consumes more than 55% of global electricity consumption, which continues to grow at a rapid pace, especially in developing countries. What this means in terms of the emissions mitigation potential is that the building sector actually has a very important role to play with respect to overall energy sector emissions targets. Previously, Samantha showed you a slide looking at energy efficiency in buildings as one of the cruxes of emissions reductions in buildings. But what's perhaps not clear in that slide is the role that energy efficiency measures in buildings plays with respect to decarbonization of the power sector. And what you're seeing here on the top of this wedge in colors are the emissions reductions related to the building sector, where first those that are hashed are what we traditionally define as direct emissions reductions. So these are, for example, shifts away from fossil fuels to high-performance electric technologies or to district energy, for example, where there is a direct implication of the emissions from the building sector from those technologies. And because these represent a small portion of the net emissions globally in the energy economy, the building sector tends to be overlooked. Where today only about 8% of global CO2 emissions from the energy sector come from the building sector in terms of direct emissions. However, when indirect emissions are taken into account, that is to say the emissions from energy consumption, and in particular electricity consumption from the building sector, are put in context with respect to the power sector, the global building sector actually represents more than a third of global CO2 emissions. And what you're seeing here, in fact, is that roughly half of the emissions reduction potential, so all of the colored wedges on the top put together, comes from energy efficiency measures in the building sector, which of course supports decarbonization of the power sector, first and foremost by reducing peak demand in buildings on power generation, and second by allowing greater deployment of renewable and clean energy technologies in the power sector that at the same time can support electrification across the other end uses such as transportation. In terms of strategies forward for the building sector, what we see is a real need to aggressively uptake clean and renewable energy technologies in the building sector, as well as energy efficiency opportunities across the building stock, whether it be buildings construction and renovation or the equipment and appliances used within buildings. First and foremost, as Thibault mentioned, we see a closing window of opportunity for acting on buildings with respect to building envelope performance, which means that we need to aggressively uptake mandatory building energy codes and enforce them across all countries. We also need to significantly develop the financing capacity and capacity building and training to ensure that those markets that do not currently have in place building energy codes or do not necessarily enforce them well are able to ensure that the building construction and renovation industry is in fact performing the way we would like it to. The second is looking again at the rapid energy efficiency deployment, where the below 2 degree scenario is in fact looking at an aggressive uptake of clean energy technologies that we have not seen in terms of a precedented scale globally in historical building energy technology deployment. This would be, for example, moving towards for example, clean LED lighting technologies in the building sector at nearly double the pace that we are currently seeing today. It would mean using minimum energy performance standards for the majority of end uses within buildings, which could be paired with labeling and awareness schemes to make sure consumers are aware of the energy efficiency opportunities in buildings. And then also providing the right market support, whether it be through financing schemes, market incentives, or even bulk procurement by government to help drive those energy efficiency improvements and lower the cost for some of those technologies. In terms of moving towards a zero carbon building sector, as Thibault mentioned, we see a need to shift away from fossil fuels, particularly with respect to overall energy sector decarbonization strategies, where most of the technologies we have modeled here in the below 2 degree scenario for buildings are already in most market today and are cost effective with respect to life cycle costs of those technologies. Part of this would mean putting in place a strategic vision, especially for the phase out of fossil fuels in existing networks and buildings today. And some of it would also be putting in place assertive market framework so that new investments in fossil fuel assets are not made, especially given the long lifespan of building sector assets. Last, and with regards to mission innovation that was mentioned before, we see a need for technological innovation, so to support research and development going beyond today's best available technologies, and particularly looking at bringing the cost down for consumers with respect to energy efficient and low carbon technologies. And we hope that some of this will be achieved through one of the particular challenges of mission innovation that is looking at affordable heating and cooling solutions for the building sector. So with that, I will hand back to Elena for the transport sector.
Yeah, thank you very much, John and Thibault. And now we move to the presentation of the transport sector. This research was led by Pierpaolo Cazzola and his team that included Marina Warner, Hans Maker, and Lisa Peter. And Pierpaolo Cazzola will present their work now. I'll give the floor to Pierpaolo.
Thank you, Elena. So I'm here to talk about our transportation scenarios. Indeed, Elena has already mentioned the key colleagues that have been contributing to this analysis. So thanks for that. First, a slide on the overview of where transport is and what are the key measures that we looked at while we considered how to profile the B2DS scenario. So transport is today representing about 28% of final energy demand for oil and 23% of carbon dioxide emissions. And these same numbers correspond to about 2/3 of global oil demand. 28% of final energy demand and 2/3 of global oil demand. In order to achieve the decarbonization of transport, we basically look at measures that first try to reduce the length of the trips, so avoid transport some of the activity needed for transportation. Second, shift some of those trips towards more energy efficient modes, for instance, in an urban environment towards public transportation. Then we look at measures that deliver improvements in efficiency, in particular in vehicle efficiency, so reduce the energy use necessary to move vehicles. And last, we also included alternative fuels, or shifts in terms of energy carriers used to move people and goods. Clearly, while we were looking at strong decarbonization requirements as those of the B2S scenario, we encountered more difficulties in thinking about strategies that could allow to decarbonize long-distance transport mode, and in particular aviation, heavy-duty road transport and shipping, primarily because of greater opportunities from electrification in short-distance modes and the possibility to use or benefit from the decarbonization of the power sector in that case. Here you have a wedge graph showing what are the modes that deliver most of the savings. So first of all, in our reference scenario, we get about 50% increase in well-to-wheel CO2 emissions, and this is nearly fully abated by 2060 in the B2DS scenario. The major savings come from light-duty vehicles and trucks, and the reason for this is that those are the two modes where you have most of the energy demand in the reference scenario. And other modes that have primarily contribute with sizable emission reductions are aviation and shipping, and that is as well essentially reflecting the importance that they have in the total emission profile. Thanks. The following slide is about how these savings take place across different regions. So first of all, I think it's important to notice that if you look at developed economies in the OECD, you have declines in emissions that already take place in the RTS, in the reference technology scenario, and that are further strengthened by measures that I mentioned earlier, so avoid shift, efficiency, and then low carbon fuels, which have been represented here, differentiating between the contribution of electricity and advanced biofuels. In the case of non-OECD economies, you see growth in emissions in the reference scenario, which is then mitigated across the projection period, partly thanks to some opportunities that exist for leapfrogging in the non-OECD. Since a lot of the infrastructure still has to be built, and a lot of the vehicles that have already been essentially stabilizing the vehicle fleet in the OECD still have to be purchased. We will now look at different modes, and starting from light-duty vehicles. So this is basically representation of the mix of vehicles that you have in the three scenarios that we've been looking at, reference, technology, 2DS, and beyond 2DS. The key messages that you get from this slide is that by 2060, essentially you need to reach nearly a full transition towards a totally different type of technology mix in light-duty vehicles. 94% of the global stock will have to be essentially electrified or using electric motors, either in the form of hybrids, plug-in hybrids, or battery electric vehicles. The priority in our scenario has clearly been given to electric vehicles other than fuel cells. This is reflecting the dynamics of what is happening on the vehicle market in recent years and the strong uptake of EVs and PHEVs. Thanks to strong reductions in battery costs and the likelihood of seeing electric vehicles becoming cost competitive by the end of our projection period with conventional vehicles. This graphic helps understanding what I just mentioned. So here you have the evolution of battery cost, which is represented in blue, and should be read on the left in terms of metrics, and the evolution of battery density, volumetric density, which is represented in yellow and orange, and should be read on the right. So clearly, battery costs have been falling impressively since 2009, from more than $900 per kilowatt hour to somewhere close to $250 per kilowatt hour. Now, the main source of this cost is an assessment that has been done on a regular basis by the U.S. Department of Energy for PHEVs, for plug-in hybrid batteries, and now has been shifting to battery electric vehicle batteries in 2016. Future prospects for cost reductions are also significant. On the graph, you see what at the bottom right, what is the potential for the range of costs that DOE sees for the future, given the technologies that are being researched today. And in the middle, in this 2020-22 range, you see some of the announcements that have been made by some of the major electric vehicle manufacturers. So this is, in short, something that shows that prospects for cost reductions are encouraging for the future, and this is one of the key elements that makes electric vehicles competitive in our, relevant in our low carbon scenarios. The following graph is a complex one, but I think it's an important one to corroborate what I just mentioned on the electrification of the short distance mode, in particular light-duty vehicles. So here you have total cost of ownership represented for 4 regions of the world: United States, China, Japan, and Europe, and for some of the key vehicle technologies, including gasoline, internal combustion engine, hybrids, diesels, plug-in hybrids, and battery electric vehicles, showing different cost components coming from the conventional engine and the engine improvements in the case of internal combustion engine, and from the battery in the case of battery electric or plug-in hybrids, the motor, and then also taking into account some of the costs related with the need to install chargers and of course the fuel costs. The results are shown for 2015 and then for 2050, both in RTS and B2DS. The key result that you see here is that in the long term, thanks to cost reduction, we expect battery electric vehicles and plug-in hybrids to become increasingly cost competitive. One of the key changes that characterizes one of the key elements that also characterizes the two scenarios, the B2DS and the RTS, are different assumptions with respect to oil prices and fuel taxation. It's important to notice that in B2DS, essentially fuel taxes, which are implemented in the form of CO2 taxes that reach more than $500 per ton by 2060, offset the decline in oil price costs that exist compared to the RTS scenario. In both cases, you end up with cost-competitive EVs, and in the two scenarios, there are very different EV market penetration. The point of this is that you end up having, the achieving cost parity doesn't mean automatically shifting towards electric cars. There are a number of policies that need to be implemented to make sure that electric cars are more appealing to customers, and these policies take place in the B2DS scenario. This includes not only short-term incentives for speeding up the cost reductions by increasing market volumes, but also substantial investment in terms of deploying charging infrastructure and enacting local policies that facilitate the driving for electric vehicles in urban environments, for instance, compared to, so for vehicles in urban environments that have low emissions, thanks to their performances with respect to pollutant emissions. And one additional point that is shown in this graph and is implicitly taken into account in a B2DS scenario is the role that could be taken by shared mobility. Here you have these green bars, which have been at some point represented with stripes. Those stripes reflect the changing costs that you would have if you move the average vehicle towards a condition where you triple its mileage. So you clearly see that with vehicles that have high mileage, BEVs and PHEVs have a much better cost profile over the first 3.5 years of use. And this suggests that shared vehicles that, essentially vehicles that would be used for shared mobility would definitely be making more sense if they became electrified. And so this, an outlook which is more favorable to an evolution of personal mobility towards sharing ends up being providing strong incentives to actually shift towards increased electrification in short distance modes. The following slide is about two-wheelers, and so I'm moving on into other modes. I'll go quickly through this. The key point of this slide is that we want to underline the importance that two-wheelers keep having in Asia, in particular, so China, India, and ASEAN in the long term. You see that the share of two-wheelers in the total, in the sum of cars and two-wheelers is starting from a much higher level today and remains much higher even in 2060 in Asia. These are strong implications on the prospects for electrification because two-wheelers are a low-hanging fruit for electrification. They are already cost competitive today in China, where there is more than 200 million electric two-wheelers. And also in terms of affecting the way oil demand develops, even in the reference scenario. If you have a stronger shift towards passenger cars compared to two-wheelers, you end up having much higher demand overall, especially once you consider this taking place across Asia, and which is a highly populated region of the world. Following slide is about shifts taking place from private cars to public transport. Here you have represented rail and bus activity. You see, so this is essentially reflecting two developments that that take place between the reference technology scenario and the B2S, the low carbon scenarios, both 2DS and B2DS. First of all, there's a shift towards public transportation in urban environments that results in a lower use of cars and a higher use of buses and rail, and high capacity rail for cities. And second, there is an element in this that reflects the increased uptake of high-speed rail against aviation, which is one of the key elements that we took into account in order to develop the strategies for the decarbonization of aviation. Once we look at road freight, And I want to underline here the fact that the IEA just published a report on the 3rd of July that actually provides much greater detail on road freight. So the key solutions that we've been identifying to move towards decarbonized transportation include systemic improvements, which essentially modify the way the logistics system is organized today and take into account much stronger solutions that require data sharing and collaboration. So essentially make the way we use trucks way more efficient than how it is today. Then solutions that help improving the efficiency of vehicle technologies, including zero emission technologies. In particular, once we look at 2DS and B2DS, I think it's important to underline the necessity to move towards either electric or hydrogen powered trucks, and the limited potential available from methane, unless there is a major shift in terms of supply to biomethane. And generally speaking, this is something that didn't come across so far. The role of biofuel remains relevant, but overall, in the ETP scenarios, there's a limit. So there's an assumption, an underlying assumption about the limited availability of biomass that then has quite some importance in the way we can use biomass in transportation, because biomass has been prioritized for long distance modes such as shipping and aviation, and to some extent heavy duty trucks, but there are modes like heavy-duty trucks where like shipping and aviation, where there's very limited scope for electrifying, and therefore there's a higher scope, there's a higher penetration of electric and hydrogen technologies, resulting in heavy-duty road freight compared to other long-distance modes. I will skip this in the interest of time, but I'll go very quickly across this in the interest of time. Here is the evolution of technologies in medium trucks and heavy trucks between RTS on the right and B2DS on the left. Well, I think there's one element that I want to underline here. We represented low carbon technologies here primarily as electrification solutions. The outlook, so this is for modeling purposes. I would say there's still an open question on whether or not low carbon, in the case of heavy duty trucks, will take place through electrification and electric system, or hydrogen and low carbon hydrogen production and a system of distribution of infrastructure, of a system of infrastructure that will allow for the distribution of hydrogen fuel. There are different cost profiles. So there's more certitude about costs if you look at the electrification route compared to the hydrogen route. But at the same time, there is also different cost profiles if you consider high density countries rather than low density countries. So the key point of this is that you need a very sizable share of zero emission technologies to reach the decarbonization required in B2DS, and that there's still an open question about which solution will actually deliver that. Here we talk about aviation. What I want to underline in the case of aviation is the fact that we have taken into account not only a shift towards high-speed rail, but also very strong improvements in energy efficiency that are well represented by the essentially by the maximize the potential available and outline from the IATA roadmap in terms of energy savings from aviation, and this is not enough to achieve the kind of decarbonization that we need in the low carbon scenarios. So aviation is the transportation sector where we have the strongest uptake of biofuel use. I will skip this. This is about differences between the extent to which high-speed rail has to replace aviation in B2DS compared to 2DS, and that's stronger in it's much stronger in B2DS. So it's one of the costly points of B2DS. And I'll move into shipping. So in the case of shipping, I think what I want to underline is we didn't take into account for a low carbon scenario a significant shift to LNG, and the reasons are what I mentioned earlier, methane doesn't have enough capacity to abate CO2 compared to the ambition that we have in our low carbon scenario, unless you switch to biomethane, which is constrained by biomass availability. So there's no, LNG has a very limited role here. The primary savings that we get are from energy efficiency. So we maximize all the energy efficiency potential available in the case of ships by 2060. We also took into account a strong penetration of biofuels. This links to what I mentioned before, to the limited opportunities to actually use solutions that allow to electrify shipping. We accounted also for wind assistance, so, and to a large extent on all major ship types except for containers, ship transporting containers, which are not suitable for that. And we also accounted for reduction in terms of activity, which are imputable to the fact that you wouldn't have any longer a need for fossil fuel trade. And last but not least, we also factored in savings that would come from increased ship capacity. Overall, the B2DS and the 2DS end up being cheaper than the RTS. The main reasons for this are lower cost of fuels, lower cost of vehicle purchase, and this is primarily thanks to the fact that a lot of vehicles, a lot of expensive individual vehicles do not need to be purchased any longer because activity shifted towards public transportation and collective transportation modes. And then lower investments in road building, which are compensated by greater investments in public transportation infrastructure. This has been a result that we have been consistently pointing out over the course of the past few years with ETP. So the new part of this is the fact that B2DS wouldn't be much cheaper, not much more expensive than 2DS. It's in the same ballpark. We get results which are in the same ballpark. What are the measures that we think are necessary to enable the kind of transition that we talked about? So first of all, we took into account strong fuel taxation that reflect the greenhouse gas emission intensities. We have more than $500 CO2 tax, $500 per ton CO2 tax by 2060. We took into account strong regulatory measures, in particular fuel economy standards, not only for passenger light duty vehicles, but also for heavy duty vehicles, and tightening over time. We are accounting for economic instruments that strengthen these measures, such as differentiated taxation on vehicle purchase that penalize vehicles that have poor environmental performance and incentivize vehicles with good environmental performances and low emissions. We took into account, especially for the short-term policies that help transitioning to ultra-low and zero-emission technologies. That's the case for instance, zero-emission mandates, but also for the deployment of charging infrastructure for EVs and the restrictions to use of vehicles that have poor environmental performance, especially in areas such as cities that are highly sensitive to, that are basically the most, where you have the highest exposure for individual to local pollution. We accounted also for a range of local policies that include measures such as congestion charging, low emission zone, and access restrictions for vehicles that have poor performance, and solutions that help densifying the urban environment, enabling greater usage and lower cost for public transportation. Finally, we took into account the fact that so that all the technologies we're talking about for long term, especially alternative fuel and vehicle technologies, need to receive public support to keep achieving cost reductions. And we warn in the chapter, something I didn't mention extensively so far, about the fact that this transition is to come most likely with important changes in the way vehicles, so transportation is taxed, moving away from from fuel taxation, complementing fuel taxation with distance-based taxes in order to recover costs for the usage of the infrastructure. This is just very briefly mentioned now, and maybe it's something worth discussing later in the Q&As, and it's something that is elaborated way more in the report. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pier Paolo. We'll probably now move to the presentation on system integration, as our speaker on biofuels will be connected later through remote connection, and we'll have to scroll slides briefly, so please bear with us. And the next speaker will be Luis Munera, who is the lead author of this part of the analysis on system integration. So Luis, please, you have the floor.
Okay, thank you, Elena. So what we wanted to do with this presentation, and those who were here in the last webinar will see some echoes as well from what we said that time, is to give you a bit of an overall picture of how the demand side and the supply side fit together in a scenario where there's a lot more distributed energy, and there's a lot more renewables, and there's a lot of integration that is happening across all sectors between demand and supply. So what we have today, this is a figure that we have had in ETP for quite a number of years of ETP, which is it shows how today what we have is largely a demand that is a passive recipient of energy, fuels, and services. So mostly energy is generated, is transformed at a large scale in centralized plants, and is delivered through networks, through transportation energy networks to consumers. Consumers consume energy in a way that does not respond very quickly to changes in the overall system and changes in prices. Now, what happens in a scenario like the one we described this year in ETP is that there's a large amount of electrification. So we headlined this by saying that the future is electric. So since 2001, if we take electricity as an energy carrier, it overtook natural gas, and the share of electricity in global final energy consumption almost doubled since 1974. Statistics that we have starts from 71. And in all three scenarios that we have here, the growth in electricity is very, very obvious, which underlines the strong electrification trend in each scenario. So you see that there's not huge changes. This is kind of a trend that is pervasive across different scenarios. And here you see on the right the change in final electricity demand in 2060. You have it by sector. You see in particular is the transportation sector that is really changing more compared to the RTS, 2DS to RTS, but also B2DS to the 2DS. Now, that electrification combined with the passiveness that I mentioned in consumers means that as we electrify different sectors, there will be a lot of inefficiencies that happen within each sectors that through more interconnection between sectors, through more integration could be exploited. So this sounds a bit abstract, so we thought we could give you an actual example today in the real world. What you see here on top, that is the daily behavior. It comes from what's called task surveys. It's a way of picturing what a residential household does today in terms of different activities. So you would see one typical day. Most of the people are sleeping overnight, and then as the day moves on, people resume their usual activities and they go to work, they study, they eat during certain periods, they have some free time, and then they have other activities. We listed them here. It's a very long list: TV, internet, or video. And what you see on top, that is Spain, and what you see at the bottom, that is Sweden. So you see already that there's a different pattern in activity. If you look at the lowest graph, what you see there is the daily electricity demand profile. So you will see that these activities match up very well. So this activity is very typical from the demand side, residential household. They match quite well with the demand for electricity both in Sweden and in Spain. These are countries that are dominated by residential electricity demand rather than industrial electricity demand, for example. And what you see is that the peak electricity demand happens with a peak in activity, and it's different in both countries. So what you see with the dotted line there is if actually there was an integration between the electricity sectors in both countries, between the residential sectors in both countries, which could be done, for example, linking it through an electricity interconnection, which happens in many places in Europe. There would be from the smoothing effect from this cross-sector integration, you would see a reduction in the peak demand. The black line that you see that is lower than Spain, for example, you see a reduction in peak demand, and you will also see a flatter profile overall, which means that power plants would need to ramp up and down less, and there would be overall lower costs for the system. Now, the power sector itself is key for reaching the deep levels of decarbonization that we talk about in this year's ETP. What I want to point out for you here, first of all, is that half of all the reductions come from renewables, more than half, in fact, 53%. And in particular, I want to point to some sources that are changing the way that energy systems are being designed. Solar here, in particular, other sources from renewables. Much of the solar that we have is actually being installed in the beginning of the period at the utility scale. So these are large plants, pretty much like they're being installed today. But as we move more towards 2060, the cost of panels is reduced. In particular, also batteries the cost is going down, and that helps to have distributed energy solutions that are able to generate, for consumers to generate their own electricity, to go more and more independent during longer periods of the year from the main electricity grid. So what you see here is the growth in distributed PV from today, which is a very small market relative to other energy generation technologies, to 2060, where there is huge growth in both sectors, but in particular in rooftop, which is the building scale PV, which is the one that really poses challenges for energy system design. You also see here as a share of electricity demand from buildings, which is pretty significant. A third by 2060 of all electricity demand in buildings is being met by distributed PV. And even as a share of total demand in 2060, and this is partly because of all the efficiency that has gone into the system to reduce the total demand, but it's quite a significant share, practically a fifth of total demand. And the key issue behind this is that as consumers generate more and more energy closer to where the demand actually is, they do it in distribution networks, they do it in areas where typically they're recipients of energy and not generation of energy. The demand and supply becomes blurry in deep decarbonization scenarios. So the institutions, the actors that are typically tasked with providing electricity, they have to be changed, and the same on the demand side. So new business models emerge as well there. So key message from this year's ETP, and one which we will echo, and maybe it's a good time actually to plug that we will come up with a report on digitalization and energy later in the fall, which will discuss a lot of these issues in a lot more depth. The key point here is that it's really distribution networks that are the hubs for smartness, for integration between demand and supply. What we highlight with this figure is the areas that we looked at in this year's ETP of where most of this integration between sectors will be happening. The first area that we highlighted is demand response from industry, from businesses, and from residential consumers, where there is a huge amount of flexibility that can be exploited at a low cost to shift when energy is consumed, and to be able to give more flexibility to the supply side, which can in turn use more renewables and more other sources that typically require this type of flexibility. And then we also looked at a couple of other areas. We looked at aggregation, particularly from electric vehicles, which is an example I'll go into a bit more detail today. how does one deploy the levels of EV penetration that we have in the B2DS with or at the lowest cost for the system? What kind of smart charging measures are required, and what are the savings from that? And then we also looked at optimizing the distribution grids themselves. What are the options for distribution networks today and into the future to cope with these changes in distributed energy resources and this blurring of demand and supply. When we look at overall, what is the reaction required from these trends, what we see is that even in the very, very short term, the investment in distribution networks needs to break from historic trends. This reaches very, very high levels in the B2DS. Practically 40% of all investment goes into distribution networks by 2060. But even in the very short term, there needs to be a break from historic trends, and the investment needs to be ramped up to make the networks ready for these new technologies. And as an example of one of these new technologies and what their impact is on networks and how this integration actually happens in the real world, we chose to show you today EV charging. So what we have here is how EV charging is done today. So there is no optimization of when it's being charged. What you see here at the bottom is a typical charging profile from an electric vehicle. What you see at the top is in gray is the profile for the whole demand for the system. So this is 2 days. This is 0 to 24 and 24 to 48. These 2 typical days. And what you see on top of this gray area, this green area, that is the load that is added because of the charging of electric vehicles, if this is done in an uncontrolled manner. Now, if we, however, move to a world where instead of doing it in an uncontrolled manner, we actually do it when it's best for the system. So particularly where there's a lot of wind or where there's a lot of low-cost solar in the system, and also when the system is not strained, when it's not during peak times, it's done when the demand is low. A very optimized EV charging profile can actually deliver a very flat profile during the day and during the night, and also have lower peaks than there were before. So first of all, as you see here, the charging can be made coincident with when PV is generating. There is also less ramps, so this means less wear and tear on equipment, on electricity sector equipment, not only generation but also on the network side. And finally, a reduction in system peak, which means less need for investing in electricity generation capacity. And what we find, so we put this together with other sources of flexibility, other integration between building sector, particularly heating and electricity, cooling in commercial buildings, also other sources of flexibility from industry. And what we see is there's a huge potential for low-cost flexibility from the demand side that can be provided to the supply side. Again, to remind you that the scenarios that we do are least cost optimization. So what you see here is an ideal world where all these technologies are deployed in a cost-effective manner. The main issue right now is that for a lot of these technologies, particularly when we talk about integrating, for example, charging of EVs with the electricity sector, deploying the infrastructure and so on, the players involved are very different, and there is a lot of coordination that is required, and there are also a lot of uncertainties into how fast a lot of these solutions can be deployed. How consumers will actually react to now having to generate their own electricity, or actually being much more engaged in their energy use. So to cap off the presentation, this is the picture, kind of below to the as deeply decarbonized scenario picture of integration across sectors, where there is in a coordinated manner, there is planning for demand side, for supply side measures, and as we show in this year's ETP, the savings can be really enormous. We have around 400 gigawatts of demand response in the below 2DS, which actually is almost equivalent to saying 400 gigawatts less of power capacity that needs to be invested in. But this needs very, very different approaches to policy and regulatory design. We're starting to see today with distributed PV, net metering and so on, prosumers, some of the issues around scaling them up. At a much higher scale, this will need radically new approaches to regulation and coordination between different sectors. That's it for me.
Thank you very much, Luis. If you could also move back the slides. So we have our next presentation will be on bioenergy, which is a cross-cutting issue in the ETP 2017, and Adam Brown, Senior Energy Analyst from the Renewable Energy Division, will present this research. In addition to bioenergy, there is another issue that was covered in this publication, carbon capture and storage. It was presented in the last webinar. So Adam, while you're presenting, we're already receiving questions on the bioenergy and its role in various sectors. Maybe you can spend some time also explaining how bioenergy helps reduce emissions in the transport and building sectors, as well as what the conflicting, how to deal with the conflicting demands for bioresources and land. So those questions already came up, so I thought I'll give you them before you start speaking. So Adam, please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to join everybody this afternoon. So I will briefly talk about the bioenergy chapter in the ETP. This is part of an ongoing stream of work we have in the IEA, which will lead in the autumn to the publication of a new roadmap on bioenergy. We published some roadmaps on bioenergy in 2011 and 2012, and we're just in the process of updating those, and they will be based around the modelling in this year's ETP. So some of the slides I show are built on this extra work we've been doing, not just what's in the ETP. So if you could change the slide for me, Elena, that would be nice. So bioenergy is a bit of a complex subject. It has the potential to be a major part of a low carbon energy system, and unique amongst the renewable energy sources. It can contribute to the transport sector, to electricity and to heat, and also as part of a growing bioeconomy, which can have other beneficial carbon aspects. But if it's going to play these roles, then the bioenergy must be produced and deployed sustainably. If it doesn't lead to unequivocal carbon savings, or it has other sustainability impacts, then that's a problem. But this is quite a complex area. You can see here just how many different streams there are going between feedstock and different production processes and products and so on and so forth. And you can change the nature of these delivery paths very easily by changing some small details, and you can also change the extent to which they save carbon or economic and so on and so forth. So this is a complex area, and in general, if you start simplifying and try to make general statements about bioenergy or about the sustainability of bioenergy, then you get into trouble. And you either rule out some things which could well be sustainable, useful things to do, or allow some things through which you shouldn't. So, but now there's the last 5 or 10 years, there's been a lot of work done on looking at bioenergy, looking at sustainability aspects, and there's much closer to a consensus on what constitutes sustainable best practice in bioenergy. But if we want to really drive bioenergy as a component of a low carbon energy system, then it needs a bit of a new impetus based on up-to-date evidence and experience, because at the moment I think it's considered a bit difficult in many areas. Now, as was explained earlier on, to achieve these low carbon scenarios, the B2DS or the 2DS, you need a complete portfolio of technologies. You need a big increase in renewables, you need a lot more energy efficiency, you need carbon capture and storage, fuel switching, a whole panoply of things. And amongst those, you also need bioenergy, and if you don't have the full portfolio, it's very, very difficult to meet these low carbon scenarios. You can't be picky and choosy. You can't say, oh, I don't like carbon capture and storage very much, or I don't like bioenergy very much, because if you do that, you undermine the chances of reaching a low carbon scenario. Now, if you look at the role of bioenergy in the different sectors across the piece, you find that bioenergy produces around 17% of the carbon savings in the change between the RTS scenario and the 2DS scenario, and about the same proportion of the consequent changes. So this is a big chunk of the carbon savings. Nearly a fifth of the carbon savings come down to the different roles of bioenergy. So this means we think that we really need to have this expanded role for bioenergy if we're going to have this low carbon scenario. Thanks. Next. Now, if we look at where bioenergy is today, you find that most bioenergy today is actually used in what's called traditional use of biomass in developing countries for heating and cooling. Actually, about 65% of bioenergy used today is used in that fashion. And of course, there's a lot of effort going in to try and reduce that type of use, a very inefficient and environmentally damaging form of bioenergy, under Sustainable Energy for All and other initiatives aiming at improving access to clean energy. If you take that out, then you see that in 2015 there's about 16 exajoules of what I might call modern bioenergy in use, and that is about half of that is used in the industry sector, in the paper and pulp sector, in other agro-industrial sectors principally, and then the rest is spread amongst the different sectors. Now, if we go to 2060 in the 2DS scenario, then that total amount of bioenergy in final energy consumption goes up to about 67 exajoules, and you can see how the share of the distribution of that changes, and this is because we've directed the bioenergy into the sectors where it is hardest to find other ways of decarbonising. So you'll see there's a huge growth in the transport sector. Bioenergy goes from about 3 exajoules to nearly 30 exajoules in the transport sector, a growth in the industry sector, and a growth in the electricity sector. The other sectors, particularly the buildings heating sector, bioenergy doesn't grow so much because, as we've heard earlier on, there are many other options you can use there to reduce energy demand in the building sector or to supply it from other low carbon sources. So we have used the bioenergy mostly in the sectors which are hard to decarbonise in other ways. And in doing the modelling, we constrain the total amount of bioenergy that's available to somewhere below 150 exajoules, given concerns about how much bioenergy might be available in the long term in a sustainable manner. I'll come back to that later on. Thank you. Now, if we focus on the transport sector, you see in this graph shows how the mix of fuels in the transport sector changes with time under the 2DS. You see the fossil fuels shrink, and you see the green wedge, which is bioenergy, grow substantially, along with the electricity component, the light blue sector. And you see here we have a complementary growth between electricity and biofuels. Some people say you don't need bioenergy because we can do it all with electricity. Well, there are some sectors where electricity find it very hard to play a big role, for example, aviation. Next one, please. And then when you look at the sorts of bioenergy that you need to meet these roles, you find that conventional biofuels such as bioethanol and biodiesel are not appropriate for these market roles which are required in the longer term, because you need fuels which are adapted to these long haul transport applications where biofuels is concentrated. So there is a continuing role for bioethanol. There is a continuing role for advanced ethanol made from, for example, from cellulosic materials. But the major demand is for advanced biodiesel, some growth in biogas, and for fuels like biojet fuels. So both from the point of view of the market roles these technologies need to meet, and from the point of view of having to have fuels with excellent greenhouse gas performance, we need to develop some new technologies to have the portfolio of fuels available that we need for these end uses. Thank you. I won't go into the other sectors and the particular roles there, but when you look at the different sectors, you find in all the cases the rate of progress of bioenergy at the moment is well below that which is needed to be in line with these 2DS scenarios going forward. For example, if we look at biofuels, you can see here that the biofuels had a period where they grew quite quickly in the early 2000s, but then development has slowed down to a few percent a year. And you see the very thin line on the top, thin blue line on the top of the graph in the recent years. Well, that is the advanced biofuels and the projection for the growth of advanced biofuels in the coming years. And if you click again, please, you can see that compared with where we need to be in the near future, in 2020 and 25, we need to have a massive ramp up of the production of these biofuels suitable for these future needs if we're going to get anywhere close to the track we need to be on track for the 2DS scenario. So we're well below the rate of development that we need at the moment. And this actually applies to the other biofuel sectors as well. Next, please. Now, we think that in order to move biofuels forward, there are 4 key actions which need to be taken in hand. First of all, there are some immediate opportunities for the deployment of biofuels in areas which are not controversial, are based on well understood commercial technology. So, for example, in many countries you have methane being generated from waste or effluents, or as countries put in sewage treatment plants, there is methane produced which can very easily be used for energy purposes. If you there are many other wastes and residues which could be used to produce hydrogenated vegetable oil or hydrotreated vegetable oil type fuels, which can be used as diesel replacements. There's a huge scope to improve the way in which some agricultural co-products like bagasse and other residues like that are used, for example, for electricity production. At the moment, they're very often used in very low efficiency plant when they could be used much more efficiently. And then there are examples where bioenergy in the form of forest residues can be used in northern countries with big heating demands, for example, for district heating, as has been happening recently in the Baltic states. So these are just some examples. There are many uncontroversial, well-established technologies which could be developed immediately. And I think we need to do this to get away from the idea that biofuels is somehow controversial and complex and difficult to do. Actually, there are many fairly simple things which could be done and which could give immediate savings in emissions and with all the other benefits. But this won't just happen on its own. This won't happen unless there's the right policy environment, which needs a stable, predictable policy environment with clear targets, with appropriate long-term remuneration available, and that all the barriers which get in the way of deployment, these non-financial regulatory barriers, for example, are removed. And then there are some specific issues relating particularly to bioenergy. like stable sustainability and environmental regulations. Also the need to recognize and monetize all the benefits. For example, if you're using bioenergy to produce electricity with a view to having a low carbon baseline generation as a complement to lots of variable solar and wind generation, then that there has to be some way of rewarding that contribution and flexibility through participation in existing markets and things like that. So this won't happen unless you have the right policy framework, and actually to have this policy framework in place in more and more countries, then that leads to a requirement to capacity building to help countries put in place these right policies based on best practice which has been accumulated elsewhere. And I'll come back to that in a minute. Next one, please. Hello. Yeah. The second is we need these new technologies in place. For example, there are a whole set of new biofuels technologies which could come into place with good carbon performance and meeting the roles which they're required. Next, please. But there are other options. For example, if you look at the way electricity is produced from biomass today, it's mostly produced through steam turbine systems. There, when you go to low scale, the efficiency of generation of electricity is pretty poor. And at the moment, that's okay in many cases because you can use the heat in district heating schemes or things like that. As we go forward, we'll find that those heat loads are less and less available as there are higher levels of insulation, as there are better levels of energy efficiency and energy performance. And therefore, we will need technologies which have an inherently higher electricity generation performance. For example, solid oxide fuel cells. We will also need technologies which can link either with bioenergy for carbon capture and storage or with carbon capture and use, for example. So that there are quite a few of these new technologies which will be needed to be got ready to prepare us for this new energy future. And their introduction also will require specific policy support. These technologies, when they come online, they're seen as risky. Usually their costs to start with are high, and so there need to be policy measures in place to help those get into the market, for example, through quotas for advanced bioenergy production, through financial de-risking, through loan guarantees, for example, continuing support for R&D and demonstration. When you actually work out what the costs of buying down these technologies so that they can play a role in the market is, it turns out to be a pretty small proportion of future energy spend, and so in our view it's an investment well worth making, but if it doesn't happen then these technologies won't be available and that will be a barrier to progress. Next please. Thirdly, we need to develop sufficient sustainable biomass supply to support this energy future. We will need around 145 exajoules of sustainable supply by 2050-2060. Now, inevitably, it's not possible to answer the question absolutely that whether or not we will have 145 exajoules precisely in 2050-2060. Now, it's still uncertain, and a lot more work is needed to quantify the resource, particularly at regional and national level. However, this sort of number is well within the bounds of a number of global estimates that have been made. You can see in those graph on the bottom a range of these estimates. You can get a small amount of supply from things like municipal solid waste. There's probably around between 70 and 100 exajoules of agricultural and forestry residues available. You can get a contribution from forestry co-products under the right conditions, and then something from energy crops. Now, some people say, okay, well, we can do this, but we should just use waste and residues. Well, that's about enough to satisfy the RTS scenario, about 90 exajoules. It's not enough to get to this higher level of supply that you need. So we need to find ways of opening up sustainable supply of that level. There are things that can be done which improve the chances of that happening. First of all, if we generally improve land and resource management and, for example, improve the efficiency with which food is produced and used. At the moment, around 30% of all foodstuffs are produced are wasted either in the supply chain or in post-consumer waste. So if we reduce that, that would already lighten the load on the market, on the food production system. And there are a number of measures like that which can be done and which should be done in any case, which will improve the prospects for food production and create some space for bioenergy production. But then we need continuing innovation to produce materials, for example, with higher yields, or to produce materials which can be produced at the same time as food crops, either by, for example, through agroforestry, or by having crops which are produced on land in the winter when it produces a crop in the summer. And there's some very interesting work on these catch crops going on at the moment. The other component of this will be the need to have a supportive sustainability governance framework. You certainly need a strong governance framework that stops the production of bioenergy which doesn't save carbon or has other negative impacts. But you must also have a sustainability governance framework which looks at how to incentivize and promote sustainable production of bioenergy. And in the roadmap we will have quite an extensive discussion about this. So I advise you to look at that when that comes out. And the last one, please. Maybe the last one. Now, doing this will require a big international effort, not least to mobilize finance. There's very good cooperation now amongst a number of international organizations involved in bioenergy, GBAP, ourselves, IRENA, Food and Agriculture Organization, and so on. There are some new initiatives like the Emission Innovation Bioenergy Challenge and the Biofutures platform, which are help coordinating international efforts, and they're very much to be welcomed. But if we're going to achieve these sorts of ambitious outcomes, then there's a critical role both for the development agencies, who will be essential in helping to build the capacity that's needed to put in place the technical and regulatory capacity that's needed to deploy biofuels in an increasing number of countries, and then the international funding institutions, who will be the key to starting to unlock the finance we need, because we need work to identify regional and local opportunities, to build up the technical and regulatory capacity, and then gradually build up this finance pipeline. At the moment, bioenergy options are very low down in the priorities of international funding organizations, because the regulatory frameworks are not in place in countries to allow finance to flow. And we need, at some point, we need to build up finance to something between 58 and 200 billions a year if we're going to achieve this. So just to conclude, next please. We think that sustainable bioenergy is a necessary component of the portfolio for a low carbon energy economy. In the 2DS, it plays a particularly important role in decarbonising sectors which are hard to get to in other ways. Transport, particularly in long distance sectors, but also in other ways. The current progress is not in line with a move to a 2DS scenario, and more intensive efforts will be needed to get back on track. And that involves, we believe, 4 key actions. 1, working on immediate opportunities which can be delivered now, bringing through these new technologies which are required, developing sustainable biomass supplies supported by a strong and internationally recognized sustainable governance regime, and then a concerted effort to work on capacity building and investment, which will require the involvement of the development agencies and international funding organizations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Adam, for your presentation. Now we have 5 minutes left. We'll see if we can continue going on, but 5 minutes for now for questions, and there are many questions that already arrived. Thank you very much to all the participants who are sending their questions along, and maybe if we don't answer your question, please send your questions by email. We'll try to respond them later. So the one cross-cutting question that came up from several participants was on innovation. So I'll ask all the participants in this webinar to maybe respond to a part of that question. The questions were about the barriers to innovation, the role of government in innovation, the main failures that already happened in boosting research and development funding, and what assumptions ETP analysis has on innovation and especially on technology improvements in specific sectors. So I would let Luis start, and then Pier Paolo and John responding with examples from their sectors.
Thank you, Lina. So I guess the first point about energy innovation in particular is the difference than in other sectors. I would encourage everyone to look into our Tracking Clean Energy Progress publication this year. We had a special on innovation and R&D, and we discussed some of these issues. But just briefly to say that the energy sector is assets, infrastructure in the energy sector is particularly long-lived compared to other sectors. So we always get this question, you know, if you see what's happening in IT, why doesn't it happen in the energy sector? One of the key reasons for that is because assets just take a very long time to turn over. So changes are in the 40, 60-year time frame, and they're not in the kind of 1-2 year time frame where it happens in sectors like IT. The other aspect is that it's also very capital intensive. So investments are very expensive. They last a very long time. That means that it's always risky to innovate at every point in the chain. If you look at trackers of innovation like the EU Innovation Scoreboard, you see that the energy sector is typically one of the least innovative sectors, both in terms of patents, but also patents per unit of money spent, but also in terms of how much money is spent in R&D as a share. So that takes us to one of the key barriers, which is really the amount of capital is spent across, and the support also needed from policymakers across the whole innovation chain. You will see also in the publication where we discuss a lot in a lot of detail about what level of support is needed at what stage. And this year, last year, sorry, 2 years ago, actually, in COP, there was a lot of impetus being given in this area by new initiatives from Mission Innovation to the Breakthrough Energy Coalition that aim to address some of the lacking funding in some specific areas. R&D is a very important area where the support needs to be continuous. It's not because the technology is already commercial that R&D needs to stop. And also, in particular, in the energy sector, one of the biggest barriers for innovation is called the valley of death very often, but in the energy sector is very prominent, is that for early stage technologies where something needs to be demonstrated and the funding required is pretty significant, there's a big gap there, and Breakthrough Energy Coalition tries to address that, but still there's a lot of room for more support there from governments and from the private sector.
Yeah, just briefly on the building sector, what we see from both the technical and the policy/market perspective is that there is a critical barrier, as Luis mentioned, given the long-lived assets in buildings, of addressing the gap between upfront investments and the long-term life cycle return on those investments. And that part of this is driven from the fact that it still is possible in most markets to buy less efficient technologies that typically cost less. And part of this needs to be addressed by putting in place the right policy frameworks, whether they be minimum performance standards or energy performance labeling schemes, for example, to help drive markets forward. The second piece is that we do see quite a few technologies that have significant potential, and that, in fact, there could be increases in the performance of those products. So to give a specific example, we see in cooling, which is one of the fastest growing end uses, that there are significant gaps between best performance technologies and what is actually being sold across most markets, where there is a price gap between those less performing products and the best available technologies, but that without the right policy frameworks and market incentives, there isn't incentive perhaps from the manufacturing side or from the industrial side to bring those costs down because they're at the right market scale. And so again, coming back to putting in place the right policy framework, we see a real need to push forward best available technologies in what we traditionally define as push and pull policies. So one, setting minimum energy performance standards to raise the bottom of the market, and two, putting in place the right incentives to help bring forward those best available technologies and to drive costs down through markets of scale in the same way that we saw, for example, with solar PV or with batteries, as Paolo mentioned during the transport presentation.
Pierpaolo, do you want to add from the building sector, from the transport sector, and also the question on the improvements that that we include in the assumptions in the ETP scenarios, the improvements to current technologies, the long-term innovation, but also improvements to available technologies.
Okay. So I'll try to be brief on the barriers. I think the main one, as this was already discussed by both Luis and John, is probably risk. And so the solution to overcome this barrier is essentially to provide clear long-term policy signals combined with, so that's, for instance, signals related with what's the policy ambition. We have seen some good examples recently from France, which has clearly stated where they want to be in 2040 with respect to electric mobility. And that clearly provides something that helps mobilizing investments in that direction from the private sector. In the case of Airbnb, I think it's important to remember that most of the funding actually supporting research, development, and demonstration comes from the private sector. So enabling that funding to be directed towards clean energy is an important element to overcome barriers to innovation. There are also other policy instruments. I mentioned the CO2 tax that we factor in, differentiated taxation that help bridge the short-sightedness of actors involved in investment decisions. So all these, I think, could help mobilizing action and overcome barriers. On the question about specific technology improvements, so we try to account for technology improvements based on our best knowledge of what is the technology profile of key technology that essentially could play a role. I think the exercise of ETP is primarily attached to the identification of technologies which have the greatest potential for the long term, if you look at deep decarbonization. And especially in the case of our chapter, we focus primarily on trying to understand, once we have identified those technologies, what are the technologies that face the lowest risks, and what are the policies that could help enabling, so deploying or developing the market in a direction that would favor their uptake, their large-scale uptake. So I think it's not just about understanding. So for instance, we didn't really work on making what-if scenarios on specific technology breakthroughs, but rather given the knowledge of what we have of current technologies and how we expect them to evolve, what are the instruments that could help these technologies emerge?
Yeah, thank you, everybody, for these answers. Maybe I'll ask a couple of questions for each author, and then you will compile your answers. So in the building sector, there are many questions and related to the, well, but John already answered some of this about the technologies that are especially needed in the building sector. But there were other questions on the role of policies in developing countries where there are limited financial resources. So the questions were, how could we promote energy codes when even some safety building codes are not met? And there was also a question about CO2 emissions and whether you have any comments related to the building boom in China and whether that would have any impact in the CO2 emissions when the boom stops. On the transport, I'll list a couple of questions on transport and then let the authors as well to list other questions that I didn't list if you want to answer them. On transport, there was a question whether we include mutually reinforcing interactions with different technologies. For example, ride-sharing, autonomous vehicles, and electrical vehicles, and cross, intersectoral or interactional effects of those technologies. Other questions on transport were on the role of biofuels in reducing emissions, and also our assumptions of other technologies besides electrification that we spent a significant time describing, like fuel cells and hydrogen, what role they play in emission reductions. So I'll let John talk about the building sector, and then Pierpaolo on transportation.
Okay, thanks, Elena. I think given the shortness of time we have, I won't go into specific details regarding the technologies or policy solutions for developing countries, but perhaps note a couple of initiatives that are important in this arena that the IEA supports and participates in. As was noted, there's considerable growth happening in developing countries, whereas Thibault showed in one of our slides that a significant portion of the floor area growth in those countries, so buildings and construction, is not currently covered by mandatory building energy codes for the entire building sector. Now, one of the key global initiatives in this area is the Global Alliance for Buildings and Construction that the IEA supports with other partners across roughly 40 country participants and another 80 or so private sector partners, as well as the United Nations Environment Program that is serving as the secretariat for this lead. One of the key points of this initiative is to try to share knowledge and best practices across partners and countries to support the implementation and enforcement of building energy codes across these regions, knowing the significant impact that construction has, both in terms of emissions from the construction process and embodied energy within buildings, as well as the long-term life cycle asset intensities from construction that is not built to high-performance standards. The other key piece to note there is that, coming back to the question about CO2 emissions in China, is that what we see perhaps as an opportunity in one market may be a challenge in another. And within the particular case of very rapid growth in building sector floor area and the related energy and emissions in China over the last 15 years or so, while this may be slowing down, there are still significant challenges for China with respect to improving the intensity of buildings, especially those that were constructed prior to 2005. And that while the emissions in China may slow down, a lot of this will in fact be picked up by other countries, particularly in Asia and Pacific, that will see significant boom in coming years in buildings construction and demand, whether that be in Indonesia or in India, for example, or even in the coming decades across Africa. So in that sense, we see that there's a real need to address, again, energy performance standards and building energy codes across all countries, where we would like to see, as one of our critical recommendations from ETP 2017, that the majority of end uses and building construction be covered by energy policies by now to 2030.
Yeah, fun.
All right. So questions I got. One is on mutually reinforcing interactions. So the example that was given was ride sharing. I think I addressed some of this in the presentation. I made the point about the importance that car sharing, ride sharing have so a shift towards this type of transition, this type of mobility could have in reinforcing the transition towards, in particular, the electrification of short distance vehicles like cars. The point there is that if you shift towards more capital intensive utilization of, more intensive utilization of the available capital, so that the vehicles, then you end up having much greater importance for operational costs, which tend to be much lower for vehicles which are shared and so therefore used most of the time, especially in a condition where you have increasing automation coming into play. So although in the modeling itself we didn't factor in this explicitly, this is one of the frontiers of model development for us. We think that the B2D scenario is definitely couples well with an evolution of mobility that moves away from personal ownership and more towards shared services. One question was on hydrogen versus electricity, and there was also another person asking about power to X or power to liquids. These are all connected. I'll start from power to liquids. So power to liquids, in our understanding, essentially this is a technology that allows to transform low carbon electricity into fuels, first by producing hydrogen and then by binding hydrogen with carbon atoms to make liquid fuels or gaseous fuels. Generally speaking, our understanding so far is these technologies are more costly than other biofuel technology, even though they have very good emission profiles in terms of life cycle emissions. And also, to the extent to which these technologies require the use of carbon atoms, they are limited by the availability of carbon atoms, which would need to come either from biomass or from the capture of atmospheric CO2. Now, in the case of biomass, we talked about the fact that we have some limitation in terms of biomass availability. In the case of capture of CO2 from the atmosphere, one of the key issues, which exacerbates one of the problems of Power-to-X technologies, is the fact that this would worsen the thermodynamic efficiency that you have to produce this type of fuel. So you would end up using very high-quality energy, which is electricity produced from low-carbon sources, and waste most of it in the process of converting it to a liquid fuel. One alternative to this is to produce hydrogen with this low-carbon electricity, and but in that case, you would basically have a high hydrogen production profile in regions with high potential for the availability of very low-cost electricity, because you need low-cost electricity to make sure that hydrogen is cost competitive. And in that case, you are basically constrained by the geographical availability of these conditions. So typically in regions which have high wind and high solar at the same time, such as Central Africa, or some regions on the coast in Central Africa. And so in that case, then you would need to produce hydrogen that then needs to be transported to the end use points, and you face major barriers in terms of costs for the deployment of the hydrogen transportation and distribution infrastructure. Also, why do we favor electricity over hydrogen? In the short distance, essentially, the type of investment you need to move towards electrification is much more distributed investment. You need basically small investments by individual purchasing electric cars to also install charging infrastructure at their homes. And in the case of hydrogen, you have a profile which is very different. It's much more capital intensive type of investment. You need to provide refueling points with an initial turnover of vehicles which is very low, so you have very low capital utilization with very high, very capital intensive type of investments to make. While in case of electric cars, you have fairly low capital intensiveness and a fairly high capital utilization rate. So that clearly makes one solution more viable in terms of feasibility compared to the other. And the long distance element is different, and long haul element is different. I mentioned that the situation is a bit more open, but broadly speaking, we do see lower risks and therefore easier implementation for electrification technologies rather than hydrogen, and that's the reason why electrification takes a bigger role in our scenarios. One more thing is, I think it's important, we also have much greater experience in producing low carbon electricity so far. Look at, for instance, the increase in capacity that has been added in very recent years to electricity production, and a large fraction of that comes from low carbon electricity. And to date, hydrogen has been primarily produced from natural gas, which is a fossil resource. And low carbon hydrogen would need to be produced in ways that we never ever had the chance to scale up so far, while this is not the case for low carbon electricity. There were other questions, just one I want to take, the rate of improvement of fuel economy. Somebody has been asking this. I just want to point out that we essentially align with what we have been advocating for years in the Global Fuel Economy Initiative. So we have a target of 50% improvement by 2030 for cars against the 2005 benchmark. We fully meet that, actually exceed that in the 2DS. We meet that in 2DS. And in the case of trucks, we have roughly a 35% improvement compared to 2015 by 2035. Beyond that, there are zero-emission technologies in both cars and trucks, which further improve efficiency and enable diversification and low-carbon fuels to come into the transportation sector. There were other questions, but in the interest of time, I think I should.
Thank you very much, Paolo. Yes, there are many questions that were coming, and yes, please send them to us by email, and we'll try to respond. And thank you to all the speakers today for very rich presentations. I think one takeaway message is that the portfolio approach is absolutely needed in order to achieve sustainability and low carbon scenarios in the energy sector, that all sectors need to contribute, and we can see interlinkages and interdependencies of different sectors in achieving low carbon trajectories. Also, the role of policy has been highlighted by everybody, that technologies are available and those that are in an innovation pipeline can come on board and be deployed, but without policies, it will not be possible. So thank you very much to all the participants for staying with us, and I would like to repeat again that the recording of this webinar, as well as all the presentations, will be posted on the IEA webpage. And you can also buy the ETP book online on our online bookshop. And if you buy an electronic version of the book, you have access to all the data, spreadsheets, and all the graphs that are included in the book. Thank you very much for being with us today. Goodbye.